The land beneath our feet hasn't yielded a crop in 5 years. An entire province is starving. And this stranger in a strange gray sweater takes a handful of dead soil and says he knows exactly how to revive what everyone thought was dead. One season, not a penny. If the field isn't alive by fall, he's gone. Now imagine how he ended up here. Dan Hurst opens his eyes, face down in cold black mud. He inhales. The air smells of rain and overripe melon. The sky is unfamiliar, too blue. There are no clouds like this in Oregon. He sits up, looks at his hands. The same palms, the same calluses. But his skin has gotten 5 years younger. His jaw is sharp, like in college. All around stretches a field overgrown with waist-high weeds, a crooked fence, a shack with a caved-in roof. No roads, no utility poles, not a trace of asphalt. He scoops up a handful of dirt and crumples it between his fingers. And that's when he realizes the first thing. It's black soil. Perfect. Untouched. You could grow anything in this. A rustle to his left. An old man is hobbling across the field toward him, a pitchfork held high. He's walking fast. He clearly has no intention of making friendly. Dan throws up his hands. The old man freezes 3 steps away and stares at him with cloudy gray eyes. Then he speaks. The language is foreign, not a single familiar word, but Dan understands every one. The old man growls about who he is and why he's lying on his land. Dan answers and shudders at his own voice. The words come on their own. He says he doesn't remember anything. Woke up in a field. The old man squints. He pokes at his clothes with a pitchfork. A gray hooded jacket, jeans, boots with thick soles. Everything is covered in mud. Where did this rags come from? Dan doesn't know. The old man spits. He says there are plenty of vagabonds around these days. The land hasn't yielded a crop in 5 years. People are abandoning their villages and wandering the roads like ghosts. He asks if he can do anything with his hands. And that's when Dan sees what the old man doesn't. Through the wall of weeds, the remnants of furrows are visible, the shadows of old garden beds, traces of what was once loved and cherished here. He pulls the nearest weed out by the roots and holds it above his head. It's couch grass. Dan says this plant isn't just a weed. It screams of compacted, suffocating soil. The earth needs air. It needs loosening. It needs rest. The old man lowers his pitchfork. How does a vagabond in strange rags know such things? Dan shrugs. He's been learning this his whole life. The wind bends the weeds. A bird caws somewhere. The old man is silent for a long time. Then he says his name is Yoren, that this is his land, or rather, what's left of it. And if the guy in the gray sweater isn't lying, let him prove it. One season, not a penny, just food and a roof. If it doesn't yield a crop, he's out by fall. Dan looks at the barren field, at the leaky roof, at the old man's lifeless eyes, and he agrees. The first day is spent scouting. Dan walks the entire plot, 5 acres, once a thriving farm. Behind the shack stands a half-collapsed barn, but the stone foundation holds. Inside, a rusty hoe, a shovel with a cracked handle, a rake, and a wooden box in the corner. Dan lifts the lid. Inside are small bags made of coarse fabric, tied with string. Seeds. He unties the first one. He pours a handful of small, flat seeds into his palm. Tomatoes. Old. Some are about 10 years old. The germination rate for seeds like these is usually completely gone. But the seeds look fine. No mold, no cracks. They were stored in a dry place. Dan goes out into the yard. Joran is sitting on the porch, peeling a shriveled potato. Dan asks about the box. The old man freezes, knife in hand. Then he says they're his wife's seeds. She collected them every year, picked out the best ones, hid them in a box. She took special care of the tomatoes. His wife's mother brought them from the Southern Valley 40 years ago. There are no tastier tomatoes in the world. His wife died 3 years ago. His son left for the city 6 months later. Joran keeps the seeds simply as a memento. To throw them away would be to throw away the last thing left of her. Dan nods. He says he'll start tomorrow, and that he needs these exact tomatoes. The old man looks at him like he's crazy. Why do you need an old woman's dead seeds? Dan replies that they aren't dead. They're sleeping, and he knows how to wake them up. The morning of the second day. It's dark. Dan gets up before dawn. He goes out into the field. He crouches down and does what he did 1,000 times in Oregon. He looks at the ground. He doesn't dig. He doesn't plant. He just reads. The weeds tell him everything. Couch grass means compacted soil. Sorrel means acidic soil. Woodlice mean excess moisture in the low-lying areas. Nettles by the fence scream for nitrogen. The diagnosis is clear: monoculture. For years, they've been planting the same thing here. The soil has given everything it has and lies empty, like a person who hasn't slept in 3 years. It doesn't need medicine. It needs rest and food. Dan pulls the weeds. Not all of them. He leaves the clover. He leaves the woodlice in the shade. They hold moisture and feed the soil with nitrogen. The rest goes into a pile behind the shed. On the 4th day, he picks up a shovel. He digs shallowly. He turns over the layers and lets them breathe. On the 5th day, he finds what he was looking for: earthworms. Not many, about 20 per square meter instead of hundreds, but they're there. That means the soil is still alive. Dan builds a compost pile, made of weeds, of scraps, of everything that rots. He explains to Joran that in 2 months, this stinking mountain will become the best fertilizer of his life. Joran grumbles that he's seen manure in his life and has had enough of it. Dan smirks and keeps digging. By the end of the week, 3 garden beds are ready. Small ones, 2 by 5 meters. He leaves the rest of the field untouched. First, results on a small scale. Then, on a larger one. He soaks the tomato seeds for a second night, wraps them in a wet rag and places them by the stove in the warmest spot. He checks in the morning. Nothing. That's normal. Old seeds need time. On the 3rd day, he sees the first little white sprout. Tiny, barely alive. But it's there. And something warm rises in Dan's chest. These seeds have been waiting 10 years, and they've made it. By the end of the 2nd week, 18 sprouts out of 40. For seeds this old, that's a miracle. Dan plants each sprout in its own spot. He cuts sticks by the river and drives them into the ground as supports. Joran says nothing, but by the 3rd week, he starts leaving a bucket of water by the garden without being asked. He just sets it down and leaves. The first sign. The village of Tiki Brody lies half an hour to the north. A dozen patched-up houses, skinny people. Dan goes there on the 10th day. They notice him right away, a stranger in strange rags. Children stare from behind fences. Women whisper. And then a girl approaches him herself. Tall, freckles on her nose, strong hands. She asks who he is and why he's staying with Grandpa Joran. Dan says he's helping with the land. The girl laughs in his face. Nothing can help Joran's land now. The whole district has tried, and everything died. For 5 seasons, the land has refused to yield across the entire province. We need rain and luck, not smart Alex. Dan asks her name. Lena, Joran's granddaughter, the village headman's daughter. Dan nods and says she should come back in 3 months to see the harvest. Lena snorts and walks away. But she looks back twice. A month passes. The tomatoes are growing, slowly, but they're growing. Dan waters them with nettle tea. He picks the nettles by the fence, soaks them in water, waits a week. The result is a dark, stinky sludge. Perfect nitrogen, for free. He ties up the stems, pins off the suckers. Every morning, he walks around the beds and talks to the plants. Not out of madness, out of loneliness. He praises them, promises sun and rain. Joran hears him and shakes his head, but he no longer looks at Dan as if he were crazy. Now he looks at him as if he were a mystery. And this is where the strangest thing begins. In the 6th week, the tomatoes start to glow. Not brightly, barely, a faint greenish shimmer on the tips of the leaves. At night. Dan stumbles upon it by accident. He goes out to check the garden beds after sunset and freezes. The leaves glow softly like tiny lanterns. He sits down nearby and watches, for a long time. He's never seen anything like this before. Glowing happens in mushrooms, in bacteria, but never in tomatoes. He touches a leaf, ordinary, healthy. It's just glowing. Dan recalls a word Jorn had mentioned earlier: resonance. The earth's power and the quality of the fruit. The better the harvest, the stronger the resonance. Perhaps the plants of this world store some kind of energy that doesn't exist on Earth, and with good care, it comes to the surface. Dan begins to observe. Which bushes glow brighter, which dimmer, and he spots a pattern. The ones near the compost pile glow stronger. The ones in the sun are stronger. The ones he watered with nettle are a third brighter than the rest. Resonance depends on care. It's not mysticism, it's biochemistry, just a different kind, but subject to the same laws as all living things. Dan smiles in the darkness. He is beginning to understand this world. By the end of the second month, the tomatoes are blooming, yellow flowers on every bush. There aren't many bees here yet, another problem for the future. So Dan pollinates by hand. He shakes the clusters. By the end of the third month, green, firm fruits the size of a fist hang from the bushes. Dan waits. He doesn't rush. Joran now comes every morning. He sits on an upside-down bucket. He is silent. One day, he asks what color they will be. Dan says red. The old man nods and clenches his hands on his knees. On the first day of fall, Dan picks the first tomato. Red. Heavy. The size of a man's fist. He brings it to Joran, cuts it in half. Juice runs down the blade. Thick. Dark. The scent hits him immediately, sweet with a hint of tartness. Warm. Alive. Joran takes a half, brings it to his face, sniffs. His hands are shaking. He takes a bite, chews slowly with his eyes closed, and tears stream down the old man's wrinkled face. He says he recognizes the taste. These are her tomatoes. His wife used to make soup out of them every Sunday, and he recognized his way home by the smell from the other end of the village. He asks how Dan brought them back. Dan replies that he simply gave them what they love: soil, water, a little attention. Joran places the tomato on the table. He stands up. He goes out into the yard. Dan doesn't follow him. He hears the old man crying through the wall, not out of grief, out of the fact that what was dead had suddenly come to life. 3 days later, the whole village is buzzing. That stranger in the gray sweater brought a basket of tomatoes to the market. Huge, red, sweet, and they glow at night. Dimly, but they glow. They hadn't seen resonance in quiet broads for 5 years, and here are fruits with resonance, from a barren field that had yielded nothing. A week later, the first neighbor comes by, asks him to take a look at his garden. 2 weeks later, 4 more. A month later, the whole village is begging him to take their plots under his care. And on the 20th day, Lena comes to the fence. She looks at the red bushes, at the glowing leaves, then at Dan. And she doesn't laugh. She says she's ashamed of that laughter, and she asks if she can help. Dan hands her a shovel. Autumn had settled in quickly. The nights had grown cold. The wind carried the scent of wet leaves and smoke from chimneys. Dan worked 14 hours a day. Now he had not 3 garden beds, but 26. 11 households in the village had given him their plots. Not all at once. Some resisted to the very end. They said that no vagabond would make their land bear fruit if it had decided to die on its own. But after Dan determined in 3 days that blacksmith Bart's garden wouldn't yield a crop because he'd been dumping blacksmithing waste there for 20 years and the soil was poisoned with heavy metals, even the most stubborn began to listen. Dan couldn't work all the plots by himself. It was physically impossible. So he did what any agronomist does first. He taught. Every morning before dawn, 5 or 6 people would gather at Joran's hut. Lynn was always the first. Dan demonstrated how to determine soil acidity by looking at the plants, how to make compost properly, why to rotate crops in the same bed, why you shouldn't plant the same thing 2 years in a row. People listened. Some nodded. Some looked at him as if he were mad. Old Gort, who considered himself the best farmer in Quiet Broads, said that his father and grandfather had planted wheat in the same field their whole lives, and everything had been fine. Dan asked if things were fine now. Gort fell silent and didn't argue any more. Lena turned out to be the best student. She remembered everything the first time. Her hands were strong and precise. She wasn't afraid of getting dirty. She wasn't afraid of hard work. And she had what Dan valued most of all: patience. She could sit next to a garden bed for an hour and watch how a plant behaved. Not to pull at it, not to rush it, just to wait. By the third week, she came to him in the morning and said she'd noticed something. The tomatoes on the east side of the bed were glowing brighter than those on the west. Dan checked. She was right. The east side got the first morning rays an hour earlier. The morning light was softer. The plants woke up gradually. Less stress. More resonance. Dan looked at Lena. He told her she had the eye of an agronomist. She blushed to her ears and went to water the beds. But Dan noticed that from that day on, she began to look at the plants differently. Not as food, but as living beings with personalities and habits. The first frosts hit at the end of the month. Dan was ready. A week before, he had harvested all the tomatoes. 123 fruits, each one hand-picked. He cut open the best 20 and extracted the seeds. He washed them, dried them, packed them in a clean cloth, a seed bank for the following year. He divided the rest, some for the village, some for storage, some for seeds for other varieties. He was already thinking about spring, about what he would grow next. The tomatoes had proven that the soil was alive, that resonance was controllable. Now it was time to expand. Dan didn't rest during the winter. He built. From stones from the old wall behind the shed, he stacked 3 low boxes. He filled them with a mixture of soil and compost. They turned out to be greenhouses. Primitive ones, without glass. He stretched a cloth made from Jorn's old sacks over them. It lets light through. It keeps the heat in. Not perfect, but enough to start seedlings a month before spring. Jorn watched this construction and shook his head, but not out of disbelief anymore, out of surprise. One evening, the old man sat down next to Dan by the fire and asked where he knew all this from. Dan thought for a long time about what to say. He couldn't tell the truth. He said his father had been a farmer, and his grandfather, and his great-grandfather, that they had passed down their knowledge from generation to generation, that it wasn't magic, but science. Just science that had been forgotten here. Jorn nodded. He said that his wife had also said that the earth was science, that it had its own secrets, that she talked to plants just like Dan, and that her tomatoes were always the best in the neighborhood. Dan smiled. He said that Jorn's wife must have been an excellent agronomist. Jorn replied that she was the best woman in the world. And that was the end of the conversation. Winter dragged on. There was almost no snow in these parts, but the cold was steady and bitter. Dan used this time for exploration. He walked around the neighborhood. He studied wild plants. He looked for equivalents to what he knew. He found wild clover similar to Earth's. So nitrogen fixation works here too. He found a plant resembling mustard, an excellent green manure. He found mushrooms on tree roots. Mycorrhiza, a symbiosis of fungi and roots. So the soil ecology of this world obeys the same laws. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, trace elements, fungi, bacteria, worms. It's all the same. Just with the addition of resonance. This world wasn't alien. It was Earth's twin brother, only with one extra variable. In the middle of winter, Dan began to think seriously about resonance. He observed it for 3 months. He gathered enough data in his head. Resonance intensified with good soil nutrition, with proper lighting, when the plants weren't stressed, with healthy mycorrhiza. So it wasn't mystical. It was a concentration of something in the plant tissues, maybe secondary metabolites, maybe something new. But it followed the rules, which meant it could be controlled, for sure, scientifically. And then he realized something else. If resonance depends on care, and if local farmers, generation after generation, plant the same thing on the same land without compost, without crop rotation, without an understanding of soil biology, then resonance must be declining across the entire country, year after year. It's not a curse, it's depletion. It's just that no one here knows what depletion is. They think the land is magical and should yield crops forever. But the land isn't magical. The land is alive, and it's tired. Dan sat in a dark hut listening to the wood crackling in the stove and thought about the scale of the problem. An entire empire is killing its soil. 300 years of monoculture, 300 years without crop rotation, 300 years of sucking everything possible out of the earth. It's no surprise that yields are falling. It's surprising that they've only been falling for 7 years. It should have started sooner. If it hadn't started, it meant something was holding the soil together, something artificial. And when that something began to weaken, the earth began to die. That thought was important. He tucked it away in a far corner of his memory, for later. Right now, he needed to get through the winter and prepare for spring. At the end of winter, Dan first heard about the gray rot. The merchant who brought salt and oil to the village once a month told him. In the east, entire provinces are dying out. First, the land turns gray. Then the plants rot. Then the people who ate those plants start to get sick. Their skin turns gray. Their joints swell. Their teeth fall out. And after a few months, they die. No one knows where it comes from. No one knows how to treat it. The great houses have blocked the eastern roads. Refugees aren't allowed into the central provinces. The merchant spoke quietly. He looked around. He said people were whispering that this was punishment for the sins of the 7 houses. That 300 years ago they did something to the land, and now the land is taking its revenge. Dan listened. His face was calm, but inside he felt a chill. A disease transmitted through the soil and plants. It wasn't a curse. It was a toxin, or a pathogen, something in the earth that gets into the plants and, through them, into people. He thought of heavy metals, of mycotoxins, of phytoplasmas, dozens of possibilities, but they all required one thing: to see this soil with his own eyes, to take a sample, to touch it, to smell it, to understand. It was far away. He couldn't leave, not now. The first full season lay ahead. Spring came early. The ground thawed. It smelled of wet wood and rotting leaves. Dan began planting. From the greenhouses, he transferred tomato seedlings, a new generation, seeds from the best fruits of the previous season, already the 2nd generation of selection. After 5 such generations, the variety will stabilize. It will become reliable, predictable. But besides tomatoes, he planted 7 other crops: wheat on one plot, peas on another, that mysterious local crop with reddish seeds on the 3rd, cabbage that Lena gave him from her own stock, onions, garlic, and wild mustard as a green manure crop on the fallow field. Each crop in its place, each following the right predecessor. Peas fix nitrogen. After them comes wheat, which loves nitrogen. After wheat comes cabbage. After cabbage, the green manure crop. A cycle, an eternal cycle. In this world, no one knew him. Lynn helped every day. She came at dawn and left after sunset. Her hands were in the soil constantly. She stopped wearing gloves. She said she wanted to feel the soil like Dan. He taught her to determine moisture by touch, acidity by taste with the tip of her tongue, health by smell. She taught him. She told him about the local plants, about the seasons, about how the clouds behave before rain in these parts, about which herbs are gathered for tea and which are poisonous. They worked side by side from morning till night and talked about everything, about the soil, about seeds, about why watering in the evening is better than in the morning on hot days, about what shape the perfect tomato should be, about whether Lena could see the resonance glow on the leaves at night. She did. And once she said that Dan's hands sometimes glowed too, when he kept his hands in the soil for a long time. barely noticeable, greenish. Dan looked at his palms. He saw nothing, but he remembered. By midsummer, the harvest in the fields of Quiet Crossings was such that the old folks couldn't recall anything like it. The wheat was waist-high, thick, with heavy ears. The tomatoes on the bushes glowed at night so brightly that you could read right next to the garden bed. The peas yielded 4 times the usual amount. Even that mysterious local crop that Dan had identified as something between millet and quinoa yielded 3 times the usual amount. The whole village walked through the fields and couldn't believe their eyes. Old Gort knelt before a garden bed and said it was a miracle. Dan said it was the compost. Gort said that compost was the miracle. Dan wanted to object, but didn't. Let it be. Lena stood nearby and smiled, widely, with freckles on her sunburned nose, with dirt under her fingernails, with grass in her hair. She said that Dan had done the impossible. Dan replied that he had done the ordinary. It's just that here, the ordinary looks like the impossible. By the end of summer, rumors began to spread. The merchant who brought salt saw the harvest and told people in the neighboring town. Merchants from the highway stopped by to look. One of them bought a basket of tomatoes for a silver coin. Usually, tomatoes cost a copper coin for a dozen, but these glowed with resonance. And produce with resonance was valued by the weight of silver. In the cities, wealthy households bought them. Aristocrats, lords. The rumor of a village where the land bore fruit again reached the nearest major city, Braunvik, then further, then even further. Dan didn't think about that. He thought about the seeds, about how to prepare the soil for winter, about how the compost piles needed to be doubled, about how he needed to find more seeds of different crops, about how he wanted to try grafting in the spring. If the local fruit trees behaved like earths, he could graft a cultivated variety onto a wild rootstock. It would speed up fruiting, improve quality, open up possibilities they'd never heard of here. He stood on the hill behind the village and looked out at the fields. Golden, rustling, alive. Down below, Lena was carrying a bucket to the well. Joran sat on the porch, shelling peas. The children played by the fence. An ordinary day. Quiet, quiet. Warm. Dan didn't want to change anything. He just wanted to grow things. But the world had already heard of him, and the world was hungry. The fall of the second year brought visitors. A woman arrived first. Not a merchant, not a peasant. She came on foot along the northern road, barefoot, in a long, dark, hooded cloak. Long black hair down to her waist, calm eyes, dark, gazing right through you. She stood by Joran's fence and looked at the garden beds for a long time. Dan noticed her while he was watering the cabbage. He walked over, asked if she needed help. She didn't answer right away. She crouched down, touched the earth, sniffed it. Then she looked up at Dan and said that the earth here sings. Dan raised an eyebrow. She said her name was Eileen Soren, that she was a herbalist, that she had been traveling for 10 years, that she'd heard about the young farmer from Quiet Brooks whose land brings resonance from dead soil, and that she'd come to see for herself because she didn't believe a word of it. But now she believes, because this land really does sing. Dan asked what she meant. Eileen stood up. She brushed off her hands. She said that every living soil has a voice, a subtle vibration of resonance. Healthy soil hums low and steady. Sick soil is silent. Dead soil creaks. And this soil here sings, as if it were rejoicing. She had never heard anything like it in 10 years of wandering. Dan looked at her. A herbalist. A half-mage, as they call them here. A person who senses resonance directly, like a device, a living device. He offered her tea. Eileen stayed for tea, then for lunch, then for dinner. Then Dan offered her a place to stay for the night in the barn, which he had insulated over the summer and turned into a sort of workshop. She lay down on the straw and fell asleep, and she didn't leave in the morning, and she didn't leave a week later. Dan quickly realized why. Eileen knew more about the plants of this world than anyone he had ever met. She knew the names of 300 wild herbs. She knew which mushrooms were symbiotic and which were parasitic. She knew when to harvest roots for maximum resonance. She knew that the phases of the moon affect the flow of sap in tree trunks. Dan listened to her for hours. He memorized it all. He translated it into the language of biochemistry. Lunar phases, gravitational influence on capillary pressure, logical, root resonance, mycorrhizal activity within certain temperature ranges, explainable, the voice of the soil, the vibration of the fungal network in a healthy ecosystem, plausible. Eileen spoke the language of magic. Dan translated it into the language of science. And when he explained to her one evening that the bacteria in the soil were little chefs who cooked the plant's dinner from raw minerals, she pulled a worn notebook from her bosom and began writing, with such a serious expression that Dan almost laughed. She wrote, "Bacteria, chefs. Minerals, raw ingredients. Plant, hungry guest." Then she looked at Dan and said it was the clearest explanation of earth magic she'd ever heard in her life. Dan said it wasn't magic, but microbiology. Eileen shrugged and said the difference was only in the words. She was right, and he knew it. Lena took Eileen in with caution. Not hostility, but caution. The two women sized each other up for a week. Then Eileen asked Lena to show her how to tie up tomatoes properly. Lena showed her. Eileen asked her to teach her how to make compost using Dan's recipe. Lena taught her. By the end of the second week, they were sitting together by the garden beds, drinking tea made from herbs Eileen had gathered in the woods. Dan saw this from the window of the cabin and felt a warm sensation in his chest. Not romantic, simple, human. The people around him were starting to become friends. That was good. Eileen had brought with her knowledge of resonance that turned Dan's understanding upside down. She told him that 300 years ago, resonance in Erelon was 10 times stronger, that the fruits back then were so saturated with energy that a single piece of fruit could replace a day's ration, that the best trees bore fruits that healed wounds faster and made the elderly feel younger, and that all of this had vanished after an event referred to in her books as the Great Sealing. The 7 houses, 300 years ago. They had done something to the land, to the very deepest structure of resonance. After that, fertility came to depend on them. Their lands yielded crops. Other lands yielded less. And with every decade, the gap grew. Dan listened. He pieced it together in his head. The Great Sealing, a monopoly on fertility, artificial dependence. It sounded familiar, like a patent on GMO seeds, like corporate control over food. Only here it had been done not with seeds, but with the land itself. He asked Eileen if she knew exactly what the 7 houses had sealed. She shook her head. She said the records of it had been destroyed, that the herbalists passed down only one thing from generation to generation. The earth remembers, and the earth has not forgiven. Dan looked out the window, at his garden beds, at the tomatoes glowing in the twilight. He thought, if the 7 houses control fertility, and if he, Dan, can restore the soil without their help, then he's not just a farmer. He's a threat. The second guest arrived 3 weeks after Eileen, and this one arrived quite differently. A carriage, black, with a coat of arms on the door, a golden vine on a dark field, 2 mounted guards, horses in polished harnesses. The carriage stopped in the village square, and a young woman stepped out, pale, fair-haired, with a straight back, in a traveling dress that cost more than the entire village made in a year. Lena ran up to Dan, out of breath. She said a countess had arrived in the village, a real one, with the Valmont coat of arms. Dan knew that name. Joran had told him. The Valmonts were one of the 7 great houses, the oldest, the most respected, and the hardest hit. The gray rot had struck their lands first. 1/3 of their holdings were dead. People are fleeing. Revenues have collapsed. The other houses have turned their backs. The countess's name was Meredith Valmont. She was 22 years old. She was the heir to what remained of the house. She sat in the mayor's living room, clutching a teacup with both hands so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dan entered. She looked up, gray, tired, with dark circles. the eyes of a person who hadn't slept properly in a very long time. She said she'd heard about him, about the farmer who restores dead land, about the residents' tomatoes from the abandoned field. She had come on her own because she didn't trust middlemen, and because she didn't have time. The gray rot was creeping in. Every month she lost another plot of land, another village, another 100 people. She asked if he could help. Dan was silent. He looked at her. Behind her icy politeness, he saw despair. Behind her straight back, he saw a person clinging on with her last ounce of strength. She's 22, but she has the eyes of a 50-year-old. He said he had to see the land first, that he couldn't promise anything without seeing it, but that if he went and looked, he'd tell her honestly if anything could be done. Meredith nodded. One quick nod. No thanks, no smile, just acceptance, like a general accepting a report. They agreed that Dan would go in a week. Meredith stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. She turned halfway around and said quietly, "Please." One word, but there was so much weight in it that Dan felt it physically settle on his shoulders. She left. The carriage drove away. Dan stood in the doorway and watched her go. Lena approached. She asked what he was going to do. Dan said he was going to look at the dead land. Lena said she would go with him. Dan said someone had to stay and watch over the gardens. Lena said Eileen could handle it. Dan looked at her. She wouldn't back down. He said okay. A week later, they set out. Meredith sent a wagon for them. The journey to the nearest Valmont lands took 2 days. Dan looked out the window. The landscape was changing. Quiet Ford was left behind. Wide fields stretched out. Empty. Reddish. Without greenery. Villages grew fewer and fewer. Houses were boarded up. Roads were broken. Lena was silent. She pressed her shoulder against the side of the wagon. She looked at the dead fields and pressed her lips together. Dan knew what she was thinking. If the gray rot reached Quiet Broads, their harvest would be the last. On the 3rd day, they saw gray earth. Dan asked for the wagon to stop. He got out. He stood at the edge of the field and froze. The earth was gray. Not metaphorically, literally. Gray as ash, like concrete dust. Not a single living sprout, not a single weed, not a single worm, not a single trace of life. Dan crouched down. He scooped up a handful, crushed it between his fingers. Dry. Formless. It crumbled like flour. No smell. None at all. Dead soil smells of rot or mold. This smelled of nothing. At all. As if every living thing had been sucked out of it. Every bacterium, every molecule of organic matter. He brought the handful to his face, sniffed deeper, and caught something. A faint taste on his tongue. Metallic, bitter, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. He poured the soil back. He stood up. He looked around. The field stretched to the horizon, gray, flat, dead, like a lunar landscape. Lena stood nearby, holding her breath. Dan said quietly that it wasn't a disease. Lena asked what it was then. Dan said he didn't know. Not yet. But it wasn't a bacterium or a fungus. Bacteria and fungi don't kill all life in the soil. They're part of life. They compete and replace one another. But here, everything was dead. Every microorganism, every spore. It was something else. Something that affects the very principle of life in the earth. Meredith was waiting for them at the estate, a large stone house, once beautiful. Now half the windows are boarded up. The garden in front of the house is empty. The trees stand bare, not from autumn, from death. The bark was gray, the branches were dry. Meredith showed them around the house. She showed them the maps. The gray zones were marked in black. 3 years ago, the patch had been small. Now it covered 1/3 of the Valmont lands, and it was expanding, every month, evenly, in all directions. Dan asked her to show him the boundary, the place where the gray earth meets the living. Meredith led him there herself. They walked across the field, first grass, sparse, yellow, Then the grass disappeared. Then the earth grew paler, then gray. The boundary was clear, like a line. Dan stood on it, one foot on the living side, the other on the dead. He dropped to his knees. He pushed the soil apart with his hands. On the living side, 10 centimeters down, there were roots, worms, fungal threads. On the gray side, nothing. Absolutely nothing. He dug deeper. 20 centimeters down, the same thing. 30 centimeters down, the same thing. A gray void all the way to the bottom. He sat down on the ground. He thought, what could kill all life in the soil at such a depth? Radiation. Heavy metals in massive concentrations. A powerful fungicide. Or something that doesn't exist on Earth. Something related to resonance. If resonance is a form of energy that sustains life, then the gray rot is anti-resonance. The absence of the energy that makes life possible in this world. Not a disease, not a toxin, a leak. Like a hole in the bottom of a pool. The water drains away and the fish die not from poison, but from lack of water. Dan stood up. He looked at Meredith. She was standing 5 steps away, upright, pale, waiting for the verdict. He said he'd seen enough, that this wasn't a disease in the usual sense, that the earth wasn't poisoned, it was depleted. What made it alive had left it. Meredith asked if it could be fixed. Dan answered honestly. He said he didn't know, but that he would try, that he would take samples of the gray earth with him, that he would experiment. That if the resonance could be strengthened with proper care, then maybe it could be brought back to where it had vanished. But it wouldn't be quick, and it wasn't guaranteed. Meredith nodded, with the same quick, dry nod. But Dan noticed how her shoulders dropped slightly, not out of despair, out of relief. For the first time, someone hadn't told her that all was lost. For the first time, someone had said they would try. They returned to Quiet Ford 4 days later. Dan brought with him 3 small bags of soil and a head full of thoughts. Eileen met him at the gate. She looked at the bags. She turned pale. She said she felt a chill from them, not a physical cold, deeper, as if there were a hole in this earth and a wind was blowing through it from nowhere. Dan nodded. He said that was exactly how he understood it, a hole through which life was leaking away, and that he needed her help to figure out where this hole had come from. Eileen looked at him for a long time. Then she said she needed time. And the book she had left in 3 different cities, and that it was connected to the Great Sealing. The winter of the 2nd year was harder than the first, not because of the cold, because of the scale. Dan was now responsible for more than just Quiet Ford. Meredith Valmont had sent a wagon with supplies and a letter, short and to the point. She was assigning him a single plot on the border of the gray zone, 50 acres. If he could stop the advance of the G, at least on this patch, she would provide him with everything he needed. Tools, seeds, helping hands. Dan read the letter by candlelight. 50 acres, 1 man. No equipment, no lab, not even the simplest pH meter. With a compost pile and nettle tea. He folded the letter. He looked at Eileen, who was sitting across from him, sorting through dried herbs. He said he needed a plan. They talked until dawn. Eileen told him everything she knew about resonance, about how it flows through the soil, about how healthy soil doesn't just contain resonance, but conducts it, just as a river conducts water. The network of roots and fungi is the channel. The denser the network, the stronger the flow. Gray rot destroys this network. Without a channel, resonance dissipates. The earth becomes barren. Dan listened and translated. The mycorrhizal network. Symbiotic connections between roots and fungi. If these are destroyed, the soil loses its ability to transfer nutrients. Weakened plants stop producing secondary metabolites. Resonance drops. New plants fail to take root. The cycle is complete. Death feeds death. So the cycle must be broken. The network must be restored. But how do you restore something that has been completely destroyed? You can't plant fungi in dead soil. They have nothing to feed on. You can't plant plants without fungi. They won't survive without symbiosis. A vicious circle. Dan thought for 3 days. He walked through the fields. He sat by the compost pile. He poked at the ground with a stick. On the fourth day, the solution came, not from a textbook, from memory. His father had once restored a plot of land after a chemical spill. The soil was dead. His father didn't plant directly into it. He brought in living soil, by the bucketful, from the neighboring field, healthy soil, full of microorganisms. He mixed it with the dead soil and set the process in motion. Inoculation, a vaccination for the earth, like a vaccination for a person, introducing a living culture into a dead system and hoping it takes root. Dan stood up. He went to Eileen. He said he needed the healthiest soil she knew of, the most alive, the most saturated with resonance. Eileen thought for a moment. She said she knew one place, the Grove of the Silent Spring. 2 days' journey to the west, an ancient forest that had never been cut down. The soil there is so alive that mushrooms glow without the moon. Dan said he would go. Eileen said she would go with him because without a guide he would get lost and die. Lena said she would go too. Dan said someone had to stay. Lena said Eileen should stay because she knew how to care for the seedlings in the greenhouses. Eileen said Lena was right and that she would stay. Lena looked at Dan. Dan sighed. The two of them set off. The journey to the grove took 2.5 days. Lena turned out to be a good traveling companion. She didn't chatter idly. She didn't complain about the bumpy ride. She carried her share of the load without a single word. When they set up camp for the night, she built the fire while Dan set up the shelter. They worked in perfect harmony, like people who had known each other for a long time. On the second night, by the fire, Lena asked why he was doing this. Not about the soil, not about rot. Why was he helping strangers? The Countess de Valmont meant nothing to him. The village meant nothing to him. He could have found a patch of land, built a hut, grown his own garden, lived quietly. Why was he meddling in other people's problems? Dan stared at the fire for a long time. Then he said he couldn't do otherwise, that when he saw dead land, his hands itched, physically, that it's like hearing a cry and not going to check on it. It's not heroism, not a duty. He just can't help but go. Lena nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she said she was the same, that when she sees a sick plant, she wants to save it, even if it doesn't belong to her, even if she gets nothing out of it. Dan looked at her across the fire. Red glints danced across her freckles. She was watching the fire and didn't notice his gaze. He thought that in 28 years in Oregon, no one had ever said those words to him. The Silent Spring Grove turned out to be the place where Dan first truly felt the resonance. He didn't see it. He didn't figure it out. He felt it. The trees here were older than anything he had ever seen, trunks 3 arms' widths thick. The canopies closed so tightly that a green twilight reigned below. And the air was different, thick, damp, with a hint of something sweet and bitter at the same time, as if every breath carried 100 scents. Dan crouched down by the roots of the nearest tree. He placed his palms on the ground and froze. The soil pulsed, not figuratively. He felt a rhythmic, gentle movement through his palms, like distant thunder, like a heartbeat, a fungal network, mycorrhiza. It was so dense and ancient here that it transmitted vibrations. The entire forest was a single organism, a single network. He began to dig, carefully, with his hands. The top layer was soft, fluffy, full of fine white threads, fungal mycelium, as thick as a finger, interwoven into hundreds of layers. Beneath it, darkness, damp, alive, smelling of chocolate and rotting leaves. He filled 10 bags. Lena helped. She didn't ask why. She just dug beside him, carefully, trying not to tear the mycelium threads. Dan showed her how to remove the layer whole, with the mushrooms, with roots, with beetles and worms, all together, a living piece of the forest. They carried 10 such pieces with them. The return trip was harder. The bags of living soil weighed more than they seemed. But Lena didn't complain. She walked beside him. She was silent. Only once did she ask if Dan thought it would work. Dan said he didn't know, but that this was the best chance he had. Upon returning, Dan began the experiment. He divided the gray soil from Meredith's bags into 3 parts. To the first, he added living soil from the grove. To the second, compost from quiet brooks. He left the third as a control. He placed all 3 under identical conditions: temperature, humidity, and light. Then he waited. After a week, nothing. After 2 weeks, nothing. The gray soil remained gray. After 3 weeks, Dan noticed the first change. In the first part, where the living soil from the grove was, there was a single, small white knot. Fungal mycelium. Tiny, barely visible, but alive. It had broken through the dead gray void, found something to latch onto, and sprouted. Dan looked at that little knot and felt goosebumps run down his spine. It was working. Slowly, painfully slowly, but it was working. Life could return to the dead. It just needed a foothold. He called Eileen. She sat down beside him. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed her eyes. She opened them a minute later. She said the knot was warm, that a faint, steady hum was coming from it, like from healthy soil, only quieter, much quieter, like the squeak of a newborn kitten in an empty house. But it's there. Dan wrote to Meredith, or rather, he dictated it to Lynn, who could write more neatly. Briefly, the experiment yielded results. We need living soil from an ancient forest, a lot of it. We need working hands. We need time. I can't promise a miracle, but there's a chance. The reply came 10 days later. Meredith sent 20 workers, 3 carts, tools, seeds, and she came herself. She stood at the edge of the gray field. She looked at the first tiny green sprout that Dan had managed to grow in the inoculated soil. Ordinary grass, the simplest weed, but it was growing in the gray soil. Meredith stood and looked at that weed as if it were a victory flag. Then she turned to Dan. She asked what else he needed. He said he needed a greenhouse, a big one, a stone foundation, a wooden frame. Meredith nodded. There would be a greenhouse. Dan stood at the edge of the gray field. Behind him, 20 workers waited for instructions. Lynn and Eileen stood nearby. In the wagon were sacks of living soil. Ahead lay 50 acres of barren wasteland. He sighed, rolled up his sleeves, and began to explain what soil inoculation was. The workers listened with the expressions of people trying to understand a foreign language. Dan simplified it. He said they would be healing the earth, just as a doctor treats a patient, only the medicine is other, healthy soil. The workers exchanged glances. One asked if it was magic. Dan said no. The worker asked then why it worked. Dan said because life is stubborn. The worker thought for a moment and nodded. It was an explanation he could accept. The work began. They marked out the sections. They dug trenches. They laid down strips of living soil every 3 meters. Compost between the strips. A layer of dry grass mulch on top. Dan worked alongside everyone else. He demonstrated. He explained. He corrected. Lena led the second team. She already knew enough to lead on her own. Dan watched her stand in front of 5 men twice her age and calmly tell them where to dig and how deep. And they listened, because she knows what she's talking about. Eileen was doing something else. She walked along the edge of the gray zone and studied the border. She looked for patterns. In which direction the rot moves faster? Where it moves slower? Are there places where it stops on its own? By the end of the first week, she found something interesting. On the southwestern edge of the gray zone stood a lone tree, old, crooked, with sparse leaves, but alive. The gray rot flowed around it, like water flows around a rock. Around the tree was a patch of living earth, 10 meters in diameter, in the midst of the endless gray desert. Eileen called for Dan. He came. He looked at the tree. He touched the bark. The sight was unfamiliar. It was unlike anything from his earthly experience, unlike anything he had seen in Erelon. He asked Eileen what kind of tree it was. She paused. Then she said quietly that she didn't know the species, but that the resonance emanating from it was such that it made her ears ring. Ancient, deep, warm, like the hum of a 1,000-year-old bell. She said this tree doesn't grow here. It sustains. It keeps this patch of earth alive by its very presence. Dan walked around the tree. He examined the roots. They went deep, very deep. He dug one up 1/2 meter and found no end. The bark was unusual, silvery, with fine cracks from which thick, clear resin oozed. The resin smelled of honey and thunder. He carefully collected a drop on his finger, rubbed it, felt a tingling, light, warm, like static electricity, only pleasant. Eileen said that old herbalist books described a tree with silver bark. They called it Errol, the tree of the earth, the tree of life, the tree that, according to legend, bears fruit that defies death. But that was considered a fairy tale, a myth. Not a single herbalist in 3 centuries had seen such a tree. Dan stood there. He looked at the crooked silver trunk, at the sparse leaves trembling in the wind, at the patch of green earth around it, and he thought, if this tree keeps the earth alive around it, if its resonance is so strong that it stops the gray rot, then is it possible to grow new trees like this? Is it possible to propagate them, to graft them, to create a grove, and to stop the rot not on 50 acres, but on all the lands? He examined the tree once more. He found a single branch with 3 buds, young, flexible. He cut it off carefully, wrapped it in a damp cloth, put it in his bag. Eileen watched him. She asked what he was going to do. Dan said he was going to try grafting, to take a cutting from this tree and graft it onto a healthy rootstock. Errol's scion lay on the table, wrapped in a damp cloth. 3 buds, silvery bark, a faint scent of honey. Dan sat nearby and thought. For grafting, you need a rootstock, a healthy tree with compatible tissue onto which you can graft a foreign scion. On Earth, this is a standard procedure. An apple tree is grafted onto a wild pear, a pear onto a quince, grapes onto an American rootstock. The main thing is that the cambium layers match. But he didn't know a single tree in Arelon that was a close relative of the arrow. He didn't know its botanical family. He didn't know its physiology. He was working blind. Eileen was helping. She brought wood samples from 12 local species. Dan compared the structure, the density of the fibers, the thickness of the bark, the color of the cambium. The closest match turned out to be hawnwood, a local fruit tree, something between a pear and a bird cherry. The fruit is small, sour, but the tree is hardy, it grows fast. The root system is powerful. If Errol took root on the hawnwood, the roots would provide nourishment, and the scion would provide the genetics. The theory was beautiful. The practice turned out to be brutal. The first graft didn't take. Dan made a slanted cut on the rootstock, inserted the scion, wrapped it with a strip of cloth. He sealed it with resin, everything by the book. A week later, the scion turned black. The tissues had rejected each other. Second graft. Different cut angle, a younger rootstock. Same result. The scion died in 10 days. Third graft. Dan changed his approach. He took the thinnest hawnwood shoot, almost the same diameter as the scion. He grafted it end to end, cambium to cambium. He wrapped it tighter. He waited. On the 7th day, the scion turned brown. On the 9th, it fell off. 1 bud remained, the last chance out of 3. Dan sat at the table and looked at it. Small, silvery, firm, still alive. But not for long if he didn't figure out how. Eileen sat beside him. She was silent. Then she said that ordinary trees couldn't accept Errol, that the difference between them was too great, that Errol's resonance rejected foreign tissue. Dan thought, rejection, an immune reaction, like in humans during organ transplants. An immunosuppressant is needed, or a mediator, an intermediate tissue that is compatible with both. On Earth, this is called an intercalary graft, a triple graft, At the bottom, the root system of one species. In the middle, a short section of the second species. On top, a scion of the third. The middle layer acts as a translator between two incompatible tissues. But what tree could serve as a mediator between Hanwood and Errol? He remembered the grove of the Silent Spring, those ancient trees with the most powerful mycorrhiza. They had lived for thousands of years. Their roots were intertwined with dozens of species. Their tissues were accustomed to symbiosis. Perhaps their wood was that very bridge. Dan asked Eileen to describe the oldest tree in the grove. She thought for a moment. She said that a mother elm grew in the center of the grove. The tree was about 2,000 years old. Its trunk was hollow from age, but it was alive, and its inner bark was covered with a silvery coating, like Errol's, only thinner, fainter. A silvery coating. Dan jumped up. He asked if it was definitely silvery. Eileen nodded. He asked if it smelled like honey. She nodded again. That was it. The mother elm showed signs of compatibility with Ariel. Perhaps thousands of years ago, when aerial trees grew across the continent, their roots intertwined with the ancestors of this elm. Genetic memory. Partial compatibility. What was needed? A shoot from the mother elm. Dan got ready in half an hour. Lina said that this time he wouldn't be going alone. He asked who would be going with him. She said she would be going, and that it wasn't up for discussion. He didn't argue. The journey took 2 days one way. They reached the grove by evening. The mother elm stood in the center like a cathedral, a trunk 5 fathoms wide. The crown blocked out the sky. Dan stepped inside the hollow trunk. The walls were smooth, warm to the touch, and yes, a silvery coating, thin like frost, but alive. He cut 2 young shoots from the lower branches, carefully, with gratitude. He wrapped them in a damp cloth. Lynn stood outside and waited. When he came out, she asked if it had worked. He said he'd know in a month. Upon returning, Dan performed a triple graft. At the bottom, a young hornbeam with strong roots. In the middle, a short section of a mother elm shoot. On top, the last bud of an Ariel. 3 layers, 3 species, 3 degrees of compatibility. He wrapped the joints in a damp cloth, smeared them with resin, placed it in the greenhouse, a warm spot, diffused light, constant humidity, and he waited. A week passed. Nothing. The bud hadn't darkened, but it hadn't opened either. 2 weeks. The tissues hadn't rejected it. The grafting site had swollen. It could have been callus, a growth of scar tissue, the first sign of fusion. 3 weeks. Dan checked every morning, every evening. Eileen checked in her own way. She closed her eyes. She listened. She said she felt warmth, faint, uncertain, but it was there. On the 23rd day, the bud burst open. A tiny green cone appeared from it. A sprout. A leaf. Errol's first leaf in 300 years. Not on an ancient tree. On a young graft. Dan stood in front of the greenhouse, holding his breath. Eileen beside him. Lena beside him. The silence was so thick you could hear a cricket chirping behind the wall. Eileen whispered that the leaf was silvery, like bark, and that a hum was coming from it. Quiet, steady, like from that tree at the edge of the gray zone, only very young, brand new, like a baby's first cry. Dan sat down on the floor. His legs wouldn't hold him. It worked. Errol could be propagated. It could be grafted. It could be grown. That meant the legendary tree wasn't the only one of its kind, that a grove could be created. Dozens of trees, hundreds, each with the same resonance, each capable of keeping the earth alive around itself. The gray rot could be stopped, not by a single tree, but by an entire forest. Lena crouched down beside him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. She said he looked like he was about to collapse. Dan said he just needed a minute. She said okay and didn't take her hand away. News of the graft spread quickly. Eileen wrote to 2 old herbalist friends. Lena told her father. Her father told the whole village. Meredith found out a week later. She arrived 3 days later. She stood in front of the greenhouse. She looked at the tiny silvery leaf on the grafted stem. For a long time. In silence. Then she turned to Dan and asked how many of these he could grow. Dan said just one for now, that they had to wait until this graft took root, that they would need to take new cuttings from it, that the process was long. Meredith asked how long. Dan answered honestly. From graft to a tree capable of producing its own shoots for cuttings takes 3 to 4 years. Fruit, if there is any at all, 7 years after planting. Meredith turned pale. She said she didn't have 7 years, that gray rot was creeping in every month, that by then nothing would remain of the Valmont lands. Dan said he understood, but that trees grow at their own pace and he couldn't speed it up, that while the tree was growing, they would use inoculation, living soil from the grove, compost, everything they had. They would slow of the rot. They'll buy time. Meredith stood there, straight, pale, her hands clenched into fists. She was used to everything around her falling apart, used to bad news. But this wasn't bad news. It was news of hope that required patience. And patience, for a person who is drowning, is the cruelest demand of all. Dan saw it. He saw how she was fighting with herself, how she wanted to say something harsh, how she held back. He said quietly that he would do everything he could, that he wouldn't leave, that if there was a way to speed things up, he'd find it, but he wouldn't lie. Meredith nodded, quickly, turned away, walked toward the carriage, stopped. Without looking back, she asked if there was anything he needed. For himself. Not for the land, not for the experiment. For himself. Dan thought for a moment. He said he'd like access to the Valmont family archives, to the old records. If there was anything about what their gardens looked like 300 years ago, before the Great Sealing, seeds, drawings, notes, anything. Meredith turned halfway around. Something resembled surprise. She said the archive was in the estate's basement, that she'd have to send him everything because the basement was partially flooded and there was no one to sort through it. Dan said he'd come himself. Meredith left. Dan returned to the sapling. A small silvery leaf glistened in the setting sun. One tree, one hope. 7 years until it bears fruit. He thought of Meredith, of how she had been carrying her house on her shoulders since she was 16, of how no one ever asked how she was doing. He thought of roses. Jorn had once mentioned that the Valmonts were famous for their gardens, that Meredith's mother, the old countess, had a rose garden, famous throughout the province, a special variety with 2 colored petals, white on the outside and scarlet on the inside. If the archives had preserved even a little, even 2 dried-up seeds, he could try. It was a strange thought, in the midst of famine and gray rot, to think of roses. But Dan knew something he couldn't put into words, that plants grown for a specific person grow differently, that care directed at a person passes through the hands into the soil, that each of his best was someone's story. Jorn's tomatoes, Lena's garden beds, Eileen's research. Roses for Meredith would be more than just flowers. They would be a memory returned. And maybe that would mean more to her than 50 acres of restored land. Spring was gaining strength. Quiet Ford was preparing for its 2nd full season under Dan's leadership. This time, he wasn't doing everything himself. Lena managed her own section, 6 plots. She drew up a planting plan based on his outline: crop rotation, compost, nettle tea, staking, everything just as he had taught. But she added her own touch. She noticed that plants grown next to flowering clover produced more residents. Dan checked. She was right. The clover attracted pollinators and fixed nitrogen at the same time, a double benefit. He praised her. She blushed. Then she straightened up and said that it was obvious if you looked closely. Dan said that looking closely was 90% of agronomy. She smiled. Meanwhile, Eileen immersed herself in studying gray rot in her own way. She spread the gray soil on the table and sat over it for hours with her eyes closed. Dan asked what she was doing. She said she was listening. That in the gray soil there is not only emptiness, but also an echo of what was. Like fingerprints on the wall of an empty house. She was trying to make out what exactly had lived here before it died. Dan asked if she had found anything. Eileen paused. Then she said she had found a voice. One. Faint. Deep. Not the voice of a plant, nor the voice of a mushroom. Something else. Something old. Very old. And very sad. As if someone were trapped down there, calling for help. Dan felt a chill. Not from fear, from recognition. The great ceiling. 300 years ago, the 7 houses sealed something into the earth, something alive. And that living thing is slowly dying, and along with it, the earth is dying. He looked at Eileen. She was looking at him. They both knew they had touched the edge of something enormous, something that changed everything. But they didn't say a word. It was still too early. They needed more data, more evidence, more time. And time was the one thing they had least of. The graft was growing, slowly, a new millimeter every day. Dan tended to it as if it were a sick child, watering, fertilizing, protecting it from the wind. He built an extra wall of stones around the greenhouse, to keep it warm, to keep it quiet, so no one would accidentally bump into it. Lena helped. She came every morning, checked the soil moisture, watched for pests. Once she found a tiny beetle on the scion stem. She removed it with her fingers, carefully, gently, as if it were not a beetle, but a piece of jewelry. Dan saw and thought she had the hands of a surgeon, precise, patient, gentle. He told her so. She looked at her palms, broad, calloused, cracked from the earth. She said they were the hands of a peasant woman. Dan replied that he saw no difference. She looked at him strangely, for a long time. Then she went to water the cabbage. A month passed. The graft produced a second leaf, a third, a fourth. It grew slowly but surely. The stem thickened. The grafting site had completely scarred over. The mother elm had accepted Errol. The bridge was working. Dan allowed himself to believe that in a year he would have enough shoots for new cuttings. In 2 years, 10 seedlings. In 3, 20. The rider appeared at dawn, alone, on a black horse, in a dark blue traveling cloak with a silver clasp. The horse was well groomed. Its mane was braided. The tack was expensive. The rider dismounted by Yoren's fence and looked around, calmly, without haste, like a man accustomed to assessing everything he sees. Dan spotted him from the greenhouse. He went out. The rider turned, young, a little over 30, a narrow face, distinguished, dark hair slicked back, intelligent eyes, attentive, a light smile, pleasant, the kind that makes you want to smile back. He introduced himself. He said his name was Cirilio Castelli, that he was from a younger branch of House Castelli, that he had come to see the famous gardens of Quiet Ford, which were already the talk of 3 provinces. Dan knew that name, Castelli, one of the 7 great houses. They control the seed trade, the largest supplier of seed stock in the empire, a monopoly on the best varieties. He invited the guest in for tea. Cirilio accepted. He entered the hut, sat down at the table, didn't flinch at the poverty of the surroundings, kept it simple, almost friendly, drank tea and asked questions, lots of questions. Where Dan was from, where he studied, how it happened that the dead soil of Yoren suddenly began to yield a harvest. What method? Magic or knowledge? Dan answered briefly, said it was knowledge. That soil is a living organism, that it can be treated like a person. Cirilio nodded, listened. He memorized it. Dan could see that every nod was followed by a calculation. He saw his guest doing the math in his head, assessing, weighing things up. Cirilio asked to see the fields. Dan showed him. He led him past the garden beds, past the compost piles, past the greenhouses. Cirilio watched. He touched the leaves. He sniffed the soil. He didn't turn up his nose. He got his hands dirty. When he saw the glow of resonance on the tomato leaves, he stopped. He stared for a long time. Then he said quietly that in 30 years of life, He had seen resonance of such power only in the greenhouses of the great houses, which stand on the empire's finest lands, and are tended by hundreds of gardeners. And here, in an abandoned field, one man with a compost pile. He looked at Dan. The smile vanished. His eyes grew serious. He said he wanted to propose a partnership. The House of Castelli is ready to provide Dan with everything: land, seeds, tools, money, people, protection, everything he needs. In return, Dan shares his methods. Works on the House of Castelli's land, under their name, under their patronage. Dan asked what exactly under their name meant. Cirilio smiled again. He said it meant that all the results belong to the House of Castelli, that Dan's methods become the house's secret, that he receives a title, land, wealth, everything he wants. But the methods remain within. Dan was silent. He looked at this handsome, intelligent man and saw fear behind the smile. Cirilio was afraid. He was afraid of what Dan was doing, not because it was bad, but because it was destroying everything the House of Castelli stood on: the monopoly on seeds, control over fertility, power through dependence. If every peasant learned to restore the soil on their own, if Dan's knowledge spread throughout the empire, the great houses would become unnecessary. Cirilio wasn't stupid. He understood this better than Dan. Dan said he'd think about it. Cirilio nodded, shook his hand, firmly, mounted his horse, rode away. Lina approached when the dust settled. She asked what he wanted. Dan repeated it. Lina was silent. Then she said that this man was dangerous, that he had the eyes of a predator pretending to be tame. Dan said she was right. Eileen said something else that evening. She said that Cirilio Castelli carried the scent of silver resin, barely perceptible, as if he'd recently been near an aril tree or something similar. Dan froze. He asked if she was sure. Eileen said her nose never was wrong. Dan didn't answer Cirilio. Not in a week. Not in 2. Not in a month. And then things got more serious. Small things at first. 3 sacks of seeds went missing from the shed. Then the fence broke in 2 places, and the neighbor's goats trampled the cabbage patch. A coincidence. But the fence was sturdy. Dan had built it himself. Then the water in the well turned bitter. Dan tasted it. He spat it out. It had a chemical aftertaste. Sharp. Someone had thrown something into the well. He scooped out 20 buckets, rinsed it out. 2 days later, the water was back to normal, but the residue remained. Not in the water, in his head. Then something serious happened. The greenhouse caught fire at night, that very one where Errol's graft stood. Dan woke up to the smell of smoke. He rushed out barefoot. The greenhouse was ablaze. The fabric caught fire instantly. The wooden frame was burning. He rushed inside. The heat hit his face. The smoke blinded his eyes. He found the graft by touch. The pot was hot. He grabbed it with his bare hands. Pain shot through his palms. He yanked the pot out and ran outside. He fell to his knees. He set the pot on the ground. The graft was intact. The leaves had wilted slightly from the heat, but the trunk stood, alive. The silvery bark hadn't been scorched. Dan sat on the ground. His hands were burning. Blisters were swelling on his palms. Joran stood next to the bucket. Lina was running from the village. Eileen was already putting out the fire with wet rags. The greenhouse had burned to the ground. All the tools inside. All the pots with seedlings. 2 months of work. In the morning, Dan surveyed the ruins. He found what he was looking for, by the back wall, the remains of an oil-soaked rag. Arson. Someone had come during the night, doused the rag with oil, set it on fire, and left. Lina stood nearby. Her face was pale, her fists clenched. She said she'd find out who did it. Dan said he knew who. Not personally, but he knew where it came from. Cirilio Castelli made the first move. If you can't buy it, destroy it. Dan looked at his burned hands, at the sapling lying on the ground nearby, at the burned-down greenhouse, at Lina with her pale face, at Eileen, who was silently gathering the surviving tools from the ashes, at Joran, who stood, watching the charred remains of his barn. Dan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Anger is useless. resolve, a clear understanding that there was nowhere to retreat, that he could leave, take the scion and vanish, find a quiet corner, hide, or stay, rebuild, protect, not with weapons, with the only thing he had, knowledge, earth, stubbornness. He said he needed a greenhouse, not a hovel made of sticks and rags, a real greenhouse, a stone foundation, wooden walls, a roof of mica or oiled cloth that lets in light. Warm, sturdy. You can't set one of those on fire with a rag. Joran asked where the money would come from. Dan looked at Lena. Lena understood. She said she'd talk to her father. The village elder could gather the villagers. The village owed Dan a debt of gratitude. 2 harvests with the residents. For the first time in years, people were eating their fill. They would help. 3 days later, the whole village was building. The men hauled stones from the river. The women mixed clay for mortar. The children carried water. Lena was in charge. She stood in the middle of the construction site and gave instructions with a confidence Dan had never seen in her before. She had grown up. In the year and a half she'd spent by his side, she'd gone from a village girl who laughed at the outsider to a builder. The greenhouse was up in 2 weeks. Not pretty, a bit crooked, with thick stone walls and a wooden roof covered with oiled canvas, but warm, sturdy, with 2 rows of shelves inside, with a stone workbench, with a hinged door, with a bolt. Dan carried the graft inside, placed it on the central shelf, watered it. He checked the leaves. Everything was fine. The silvery stem stood straight. 4 leaves glistened in the diffused light. Dan exhaled. Then Dan wrote to Meredith, told her about the arson, about Castelli, about needing protection. Not an army, just one reliable person who would be there, who could scare off those who came at night. The reply came a week later, not by letter, by person. A tall woman, slightly plump, short haircut, a scar across her left eyebrow, a sword at her belt, a light travel bag on her back. She stopped at the gate. She surveyed the yard, the greenhouse, the garden beds, the field. She looked at Dan, briefly, intently, like a predator assessing not its prey, but its territory. She introduced herself, Ha-Won Cho, former instructor of the Valmont Combat Guard, sent by order of Countess Meredith to ensure security. She spoke in short sentences, no unnecessary words, no smile. Dan showed her the cabin, the barn, the greenhouse, fields. She inspected everything, silently. Then she said the perimeter was weak, that the fence was useless, that the approaches to the greenhouse were open on 3 sides, that at night a single person with a torch could bypass any peasant guard. Dan asked what she suggested. Ha-Won said she suggested a ditch around the greenhouse, filled with water, dry branches at the approaches, they crackle underfoot, warning ropes with bells, and herself, every night, at the door. Dan asked when she slept. Ha-Won said she slept during the day, 2 hours at a time. That was enough. Dan didn't argue. Ha-Won got everything set up in a day, dug the ditch, stretched out the ropes, laid out the branches, took her place by the greenhouse door, sword across her knees. Her eyes were open. Her back was straight. She didn't talk to people. She didn't go to the village. She ate very little. Dan noticed this on the 3rd day. She took a piece of bread and a glass of water. That was all. On the 4th day, she took half a piece of bread. On the 5th day, just water. He asked Eileen if she knew what was going on. Eileen looked at Ha-Won from a distance. She was silent. She said she saw emptiness in her. Not physical, deeper. Like in a person who has decided they are unworthy of something simple. Dan didn't pry. He didn't ask. He didn't press her. He simply left a single apple on the windowsill of the shed where Ha-Won had spent the night on the morning of the 6th day. Red, small, from the last of last year's supplies, with a faint glow of resonance. By evening, the apple was gone. Dan didn't say a word. The next morning, he left a handful of dried strawberries, A day later, a slice of pumpkin. 3 days later, a piece of melon from the supply he'd been saving for seeds. Each time in silence. Each time on the windowsill. Hawan never mentioned it, but the food disappeared every time, and the portions of bread she took at lunch became slightly larger. Lina noticed. She asked Dan why he fed the cat through the windowsill. Dan said that cats like it when people don't bother them. Lina looked at him for a long time. Then she quietly said that he was a strange but good person, and she left before he had a chance to answer. The summer of the second year was a time of construction, not just greenhouses. Dan was building a system. He divided all the gardens of Quiet Broads into 4 zones based on crop rotation. Each zone rotated every year: wheat, legumes, root crops, green manure, a 4-year cycle. Every plot knew its plan 4 years in advance. It was a revolution. The locals were used to planting whatever they wanted wherever they wanted. Some grumbled. They said Dan was meddling in things that weren't his business, that their grandfathers hadn't done it that way. Dan didn't argue. He simply showed the results. On the plots where crop rotation had been in place for 2 years, the yield was twice as high. In those where people had resisted, it was 1.5 times lower. The numbers spoke for themselves. By fall, there were no more resistors left. Work was proceeding in parallel on the Valmont lands. 20 workers sent by Meredith were laboring under Lina's supervision. Dan went there once every 2 weeks. He checked. He made adjustments. The inoculation was working, slowly. But the gray soil on the treated plots began to darken. Not quickly. Over 3 months, the gray color turned a dirty brown. This meant the microorganisms were taking hold. They were starting to work, decomposing the organic matter from the compost, building a new network. In one section, Dan planted clover. In the fall of the second year, Dan went to the Valmont estate. Not for the fields, for the archives. Meredith kept her word. The basement had been cleared out. 3 rooms, stone walls, damp air, shelves reaching the ceiling, scrolls, books, bundles of letters, maps, drawings. 300 years of one house's history. Dan went downstairs with an oil lamp and spent 4 days there. Meredith brought him food. She set the tray by the door, silently. Dan didn't notice. He ate when he remembered. He was looking for 2 things: records of the gardens before the Great Sealing, and seeds. Any old seeds that might have been preserved in the archives. He found the first on the second day. The diary of Meredith's great-great-grandmother, a woman named Elizara Valmont. The entries were neat, small handwriting. The ink had faded but was still legible. Elizara described the estate's gardens 50 years before the Great Sealing. Trees that bore fruit year-round, grapes with berries the size of eggs, roses that bloomed in winter, wheat that glowed in the field at night like a sea of stars, and the aril trees. Elisara mentioned them as if they were commonplace. She wrote that there were 12 aril trees in the grove behind the estate, and that every spring they bloomed with white flowers that glowed green, that the fruits ripen by fall, that they are silvery, the size of an apple, that whoever eats them feels younger, and that the old nanny, who was over 80, ate them every year and looked 60. Dan read and reread. 12 trees, a common occurrence, fruits every year. And all of this disappeared after the sealing. What the 7 houses did, what they sealed, why the aril trees disappeared. On the 3rd day, he found something else, a letter, undated, unsigned, tucked between the pages of Elizara's diary, written in a different hand, hasty, nervous. The author wrote that the 7 houses had made a decision, that the creature beneath the ground was too dangerous, that its resonance was uncontrollable, that it bestowed fertility on everyone equally, and this destroyed the hierarchy, that it must be sealed and its resonance redirected through controlled channels, through the lands of the 7 houses. Then fertility would depend on proximity to the houses, and the houses would become indispensable. Dan placed the letter on the table. His hands didn't tremble, but inside, everything became very quiet, very clear. The seven houses did not save the world from a dangerous creature. They took the world's free fertility away, redirected it through themselves, created a monopoly not on seeds, on the very life of the earth. 300 years. For 300 years, an entire empire depended on 7 families because these families stole the earth's voice. And now the seal was cracking. The resonance was draining away. The earth was dying, not from disease, from the fact that the living being beneath it was dying in confinement. And the gray rot isn't an attack. It's agony. He rose from the basement. Meredith was waiting in the living room, sitting by the window, looking out at the dead garden. Dan sat down across from her. He told her everything. About the diary, about the letter, about what the 7 houses had done 300 years ago. Meredith listened. Her face didn't change. Not a single muscle. Only her hands. Her hands gripped the armrests of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When Dan finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said she knew. Not everything, not the details. But she knew that her ancestors had done something terrible, that every head of the House of Valmont knew. And he remained silent, because to admit it meant losing everything. She asked what now. Dan said that now he knew what he hadn't known before, that the arrow tree wasn't just a plant, that it was a descendant of that creature, a part of it, its seed, and that if they grew it and let it bloom, it could restore the severed connection, bring resonance back to the earth. Meredith asked what would happen to the 7 houses. Dan said their monopoly would end, that fertility would return to everyone, that any peasant in any field would be able to grow a crop with resonance. Meredith stood up. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to it, slender, upright, in a dress that was now too big for her because she had lost weight over the past year. She said quietly that House Valmont deserved this, that 3 centuries of lies were enough, that she would not stand in the way. Dan looked at her back, at her slender shoulders, at the way she held herself, straight, always straight, even when the world around her was falling apart. He stood up, walked over to her, said he'd found something in the archives, something for her, not for the house, for her personally. Meredith turned around. Dan took a small envelope, old, yellowed. He poured 2 small dry seeds into his palm, dark, wrinkled. Meredith looked. She didn't understand. Dan said he'd found them tucked inside Elizara's diary, in an entry where she described the rose garden. 2 colored roses, white on the outside, scarlet on the inside. The very roses Meredith's mother had grown, the ones that died when the gray rot reached the garden. 2 seeds, maybe the last ones. Meredith looked at his palm, at the 2 tiny seeds. Her face didn't change, her back remained straight, but a single tear rolled down her cheek. 1. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand. She said that Dan had a habit of finding what was dead and bringing it back to life. Dan said the seeds weren't dead, that they were sleeping. Meredith looked at him. For the first time since they'd met, her eyes weren't tired. They were warm. For a second. Then she became Countess Valmont again. Upright, composed, businesslike. She said he needed to go back and protect the graft, that the Castellis wouldn't stop at arson, that she would send more people, that she would come herself in a month. Dan nodded. He put the seeds in his breast pocket, close to his heart. He drove home. He returned to Quiet Broads 2 days later. Lina met him at the gate. She said that while he was gone, strangers had come. 2 of them. They pretended to be itinerant workers. They asked to work as laborers. Lina didn't believe them. Their hands were suspiciously clean. They asked too many questions about the greenhouse. She sent them to the village head and warned Haywan. Haywan followed them at night. They didn't go to the village head. They took the northern road, toward Braunvik, the town where the Castellis have a trading post. Spies. Dan nodded. He asked Haywan what she thought. Heiwan said the next step would be more serious, that the spies had come to scout, that now they knew the layout, the greenhouse, the people, the weak spots, that the nighttime arson was a test. Next would be a squad, 5 people, maybe 10, professionals, not the kind who throw a rag and run away, the kind who go in, do the job, leave. Dan asked what to do. Hawan paused. Then she said he needed allies, that she alone couldn't hold off 10 men, that they needed people, or walls, or both. Dan looked at Lena. Lena said the village would help, that the men would stand guard, that they weren't soldiers, but they were on their own land and would defend it. Dan looked at Eileen. Eileen said she knew people in 2 towns who owed her a favor, herbalists and hunters, not an army, but eyes and ears. Dan nodded. He realized he wouldn't be just a farmer anymore, that the world wouldn't let him quietly tend his garden, that every root he saved, every sprout he grew, made him more dangerous to those who controlled this empire. He stepped out into the yard. He stood and looked at the fields, golden with autumn, warm, alive. At the greenhouse with stone walls, at Errol's grafting table behind the thick door, at the people around him. Lenu, Eileen, Hawan, Yoren at the threshold. He didn't want to fight, didn't want to be a lord, didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to graft a new variety of pear and not answer letters. But the world came to him, and to turn away would mean betraying everyone who believed in him. He turned to the others, said it was time to build a farm, a real one, not 3 garden beds and a greenhouse, a big one, a secure one, with people, with students, with a system. If they follow him, let them follow. But he isn't going to hide. He's going to grow. Lena exhaled, as if she'd been waiting for those words. Heiwan nodded, briefly, in a military manner. Eileen smiled, quietly, with that smile that appeared on her face when she learned something important about a person. Yoren, from the doorway, said it was long overdue and that the guy had dragged his feet for too long. The winter of the 2nd year was a turning point. Dan was no longer working alone. Meredith sent 30 workers. The village provided 12 volunteers. Eileen brought 2 former students from the city, young herbalists who wanted to learn. Lena recruited 5 girls from neighboring villages, strong, hardworking, ready to dig from dawn till dusk. Dan stood before them on the hill behind the village and explained the plan. This will be Hurst's garden, he gestured with his hands. Greenhouses on the southern slope, a nursery for seedlings behind the greenhouses, a composting station on the northern side, away from the living quarters, fields with crop rotation on the eastern slope, an orchard on the western slope, a house in the center, a workshop, a seed bank, a classroom. People listened, some with enthusiasm, some with skepticism. One of Meredith's workers asked why a classroom was needed. Dan replied that knowledge couldn't be kept in just one mind, that he wasn't immortal. What if he were killed tomorrow? Everything he knew would die with him. But if he taught 10 people, they would teach 100, and the knowledge would live on. The worker thought. He nodded. They built all winter, stone from the river, wood from the forest, clay for mortar from the riverbank. They worked 6 days a week. The 7th day, they rested. Dan didn't rest. He designed. He sketched on the ground with a stick. He calculated in his head. Lena asked how he knew how to build greenhouses. Dan said he'd seen a lot of greenhouses in his life. He wasn't lying. He just didn't specify which life. By spring, there were 3 greenhouses, big ones, stone ones, with wooden roofs and mica windows. Meredith brought the mica. It was expensive, but she didn't haggle. A nursery nearby, 20 seedling beds, a composting station with 3 pits at different stages of decomposition, a seed storage room, dry, cool, with shelves and labels. Dan set up a record-keeping system. Every little bag of seeds had a label: name, harvest date, selection generation, characteristics. Lena kept the records. Her handwriting was neater than Dan's. The aerial graft was moved to the central greenhouse. It had grown over the winter. Now it was a small tree, 1/2 meter tall, silvery bark, 6 branches, 18 leaves. Each one glowed with a soft green light at night. Eileen said its resonance filled the entire greenhouse, that other plants growing near it grew faster, that the soil around the pot hummed like a little bell. Dan observed. He took notes. He measured its growth every week. Errol grew faster than any tree he had ever seen. Not supernaturally fast, but noticeably so, as if the roots were drawing not only water and minerals from the soil, but something else as well. That very energy, that very resonance. In the spring, Dan turned his attention to roses, 2 seeds from the Valmont archive. He soaked them just as he had once done with Yoren's tomatoes, wrapped them in a damp cloth. He placed them in a warm spot. He waited. 10 days, nothing. 12, 14. On the 15th day, 1 seed sprouted, a tiny white root. Dan transferred it to a pot with better soil. He covered it. He watered it. He waited some more. The second seed didn't sprout. After a month, it became clear that it was dead. 1 rose. Just 1. He couldn't take any chances. He tended to it as if it were Ariel's graft, even more tenderly. Because this rose wasn't for the world. It was for one person. For a woman who carries the weight of 3 centuries of others' sins on her shoulders. A sprout appeared 3 weeks later, small, with 2 little leaves, light green, ordinary in appearance, no glow, no resonance, just a rose. But Dan knew that in a year it would bloom, and Meredith would see the flower she had last seen as a child in her mother's garden, white on the outside, scarlet on the inside, with a scent she had forgotten and would remember instantly. At the same time, Dan began teaching, for real. Every morning, students gathered in the classroom, 12 people, 5 girls from neighboring villages, 2 herbalists from Eileen's, 3 farmers from Quietford, and 2 of Meredith's workers who turned out to be smarter than the rest. Dan explained the basics, what soil is, what it's made of, how roots work, why mushrooms are needed, why you can't plant the same thing 2 years in a row, what compost is, how to make a nettle infusion, how to determine acidity by looking at plants, how to choose seeds, how to dry them, how to store them. Lina helped lead the classes. She already knew the material by heart. She could explain some things better than Dan, because she spoke the language of the peasants, not that of a scientist. Dan explained why legumes need nodule bacteria. Lina explained that peas feed the soil, and the soil then feeds the wheat. It was the same thing, but her words got through faster. Dan noticed this and began to give her the floor at the blackboard more and more often. She didn't ask. He simply stepped aside and nodded, and she spoke, confidently, calmly, like someone who had found their place. Once, after class, she approached him. She said quietly that she wanted to show him something. She led him to the western slope, to where Dan was planting an orchard. There stood 10 young trees, hornbeams, which Dan had planted in the fall for future grafting. Lynette led him to one. She pointed to a tag on the trunk. The tag had one word written on it. Lynette. Dan didn't understand. He looked at Lynette. She blushed. She said she'd heard him talking to the trees, how he gives them names. She said she'd named this tree herself, because she wanted her name to grow somewhere too. Dan looked at the tag, at the clumsy letters, at the sapling tied to a stake, at the girl standing next to him who couldn't look at him. He said that Lynetta was a beautiful name for an apple tree. Lynette looked up. She said it was a hornbeam, not an apple tree. Dan said it would be an apple tree, that he would graft the best variety he could breed onto this rootstock, and that this variety would be called Lynetta, always, in every garden where it was planted. Lena stood there. She watched. Her freckles grew brighter on her pink cheeks. She opened her mouth, closed it, turned and walked quickly toward the greenhouses. Dan saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand as she walked. Meredith arrived at the beginning of summer, not alone. With her was a man in a city guard uniform, a lieutenant from Braunwick. Meredith explained. The House of Castelli had begun to act openly. They had filed a complaint with the imperial court. They accused Dan of the illegal use of resonance technologies, of violating the seed law, of encroaching on the privileges of the great houses. Formally, anyone who grows a product with resonance above a certain level is required to have a license from one of the 7 houses. Dan doesn't have a license. The lieutenant was polite, apologetic. He said that the law is the law, that he had been ordered to inventory the farm and draw up a report. Dan stood there. He listened. He understood this wasn't about the law, it was about control. Castell couldn't kill him openly, so he'd crush him with bureaucracy, take away the farm, ban him from growing, destroy what he'd been building for 2 years. Meredith stepped forward. Her voice turned icy. She said that Dan worked on the lands of the House of Valmont, that his farm was under the jurisdiction of the Valmonts, that the House of Valmont had all the necessary licenses, and that if the Castellis wanted to contest this, they should file a lawsuit against the Valmonts. The lieutenant turned pale. He had no intention of arguing with the great house. He apologized. He left. Meredith turned to Dan. Soyen appeared in the summer of the 3rd year. Dan found her on the road. He was on his way to Braunwick for mica for the new greenhouse. He saw a figure by the roadside, small, hunchbacked, crouching. He approached. A girl. No, a young woman, about 17, skinny to the point of transparency. Bones jutted out from under her tattered clothes, black hair, matted, her face gray with dust. And her hands. Dan saw her hands and stopped. Burns on both palms and fingers, old ones, healed but terrifying, red scar tissue, twisted fingers, traces of how these hands had once grabbed something hot and wouldn't let go. She raised her head. Her eyes were huge, dark, empty, like 2 bottomless wells. She didn't ask for help, didn't ask for food. She just looked. Dan sat down next to her. He took some bread out of his bag, placed it next to her, not in her hands, next to her, so she could decide for herself. She looked at the bread for a long time. Then she took it. She ate slowly, crumb by crumb, like someone who hasn't eaten in a long time and is afraid her stomach won't accept it. Dan waited. When she finished eating, he asked where she was from. She was silent. He asked her name. She said one word, Soyen. Then she fell silent for another hour. Then she spoke, quietly, monotonously, like someone recounting a dream. She was from the eastern province, from the village of Stone Ford. The village lived off viticulture, 300 people, 4 generations on the same land. Gray rot came 2 years ago. First the vineyards. The vines turned gray in a week. Then the fields. Then the orchards. Then the wells. The water turned bitter. Food stopped growing. People began to fall ill. Their skin turned gray. Their joints swelled. The children first. The elderly second. Her mother. Her father. Her younger sister. One by one. Soyen tried to save what she could. She pulled living vines from the gray earth with her bare hands. She transplanted them into pots. She carried them into the house. She watered them. Nothing helped. The vines turned gray in the pots, too. She burned the gray earth. She thought the fire would purify it. She grabbed the burning clods with her hands. She put them out. She set them on fire again. Her hands were burning. She didn't stop. It was useless. Everything was useless. The village died in 4 months. Soyen was the last to leave, the only survivor. She walked west because someone had said that in the west there was a man who knew how to heal the earth. She walked for 2 months. She ate whatever she found. She slept under the trees. And she made it. Dan listened. He was silent. He looked at her hands. at the burns that were not from the fire of salvation, but from despair, from the inability to let go. He stood up. He held out his hand to her. She looked at his palm, then at her own face. Then she took it. Her fingers were cold and stiff from the scars. He brought her to quiet Ford. Lina saw her. She ran to fetch water and a blanket. Eileen prepared a herbal decoction. Hawan silently gave up her place by the stove for her. Dan was warm in the house. Soyeon lay there. She slept for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she got up. She went out into the yard. She looked at the garden beds, at the greenhouses, at the green fields all around, at the children playing by the fence, and she cried, silently, standing, without covering her face. Tears streamed down her dust-gray cheeks and fell to the ground. Dan approached. He stood beside her. He said nothing. When she quieted down, he asked if she wanted to stay. She said yes. He asked if she wanted to learn. She looked at him. For the first time, something other than emptiness flashed in her eyes. A faint glimmer, small, like a candle in an empty room. She said yes. Dan led her to the greenhouse. He showed her the table with the pots. He showed her the soil. He showed her the seeds. He said she would have her own plot, not someone else's, her own, and that she would use it to restore the varieties of her homeland. Every variety they could find or recreate from what remained of the eastern provinces. Soyeon stood before the table. She looked at the soil in the pot. Then she stretched out her scorched hand and touched the soil with her fingertips. Slowly, like a person stroking the cheek of a sleeping child. Dan said something else. He said that they would name every saved variety after someone from her village. Her mother, her father, her sister, her neighbors, everyone she remembered. Soyeon froze. Fingers in the soil, eyes closed. She wasn't crying. She was holding on. She held on to everything inside her just as she had held on to those burning clods of earth back then. Only now the earth was alive. Then she opened her eyes. She said she needed a notebook. Dan gave her a notebook. Lina gave her a pen and ink. That very evening, Soyeon began to write. A list of names. Stone Ford, 300 people. She remembered every one of them. She called this notebook the Book of Returned Names. Soyeon settled into the household within a week, silent, determined. She worked harder than anyone else. She got up before Dan. She went to bed later. She wrote down everything she heard in class, every word, every formula, every recipe. Her handwriting was small and neat. The notebook filled up page by page. A month later, Dan discovered that Soyeon had memorized his crop rotation system better than half the students who had been studying for 6 months. She didn't just memorize, she understood. She asked questions that no one else asked. Why does compost from some plants work better than from others? Why do mycorrhizal fungi prefer certain roots? Why does resonance in fruits intensify under stress if stress is harmful to the plant? Dan answered, sometimes at length. Sometimes he honestly admitted he didn't know. She nodded and wrote even that down. I don't know. The 3 most honest words in science. Eileen took a liking to Soyeon right away, quietly, in her own way. She brought her tea every evening. She talked about the herbs of the eastern provinces, the ones Soyeon had known since childhood. Soyeon listened and sometimes corrected her. Eileen wrote down the corrections with the same serious expression she used when writing down Dan's explanations about chef bacteria. Haewon treated Soyeon differently than the others, more sternly, more harshly. She made her eat 3 times a day. She didn't ask. She made her. She silently placed a plate in front of her and didn't leave until she had eaten everything. Soyeon obeyed. Perhaps because she sensed behind the sternness what Haewon was hiding from everyone, that she knew what it was like not to eat, that she knew what it was like to consider herself unworthy of a simple piece of bread. A silent understanding arose between them. 2 women with burns, one in her arms, the other inside. Summer was gaining strength. Hurst's garden was growing. Ariel's graft had reached a meter in height, 10 branches, 32 leaves. Dan made up his mind. He cut 2 cuttings from the lower branches, the first cuttings. If the grafts took root in a year, he would have 3 trees instead of 1. He performed a triple graft on 2 new rootstocks, Hawnwood, a mother elm shoot, an Ariel scion. Same technique, same order. Both scions took root. Both produced buds after 3 weeks. Dan showed no joy. He simply noted it in his mind. The method works consistently. It can be scaled up, 10 trees in a year. The winter of the 3rd year brought Avery sane. She did not arrive on foot or by carriage, on horseback, alone, in a men's traveling suit, red hair tied in a bun, a notebook and an abacus in her saddlebags. No one behind her. She stopped at the gate to Hurst's garden, dismounted, surveyed the greenhouses, the fields, the compost pits, the classroom, the nursery. She counted the garden beds. She counted the seedlings. She counted the workers. Then she found Dan in the greenhouse. She introduced herself. She said she was Victor Sane's daughter, the largest seed merchant in the capital, that she had run away from home 3 weeks ago, that she had been engaged to Cirilio Castelli, and that she'd rather sleep in a ditch than marry a man who sets fire to other people's greenhouses. Dan raised an eyebrow. He asked how she knew about the arson. Avery said she knew a lot, that at her father's house she had access to business correspondence, that she knew who buys seeds from Castelli, who sells them, at what prices, which varieties are monopolized and which are permitted for free trade, that she knows how the seed market in the empire works better than anyone but the heads of the houses themselves, and that she wants to offer Dan a deal. She handles the commercial side of the business, sales, purchases, contracts, connections. In return, he gives her a roof over her head and doesn't ask questions about why she ran away. Dan looked at her, red-haired, witty, with sharp eyes that analyze everything they see. Not at all like someone who sleeps in ditches. He asked why she needed this. She could have gone to any city, started her own business. She's the daughter of a wealthy merchant. She must have money. Avery smiled wryly. She said she had exactly as much money as she had in her pockets when she left. That her father had disowned her that very day. That the Castellis had declared her a runaway. That her property had been seized. That she was the daughter of a wealthy merchant who didn't have a penny to her name. But she had a brain. And a notebook. Dan fell silent. He needed someone who understood trade. He was an agronomist, not a merchant. He knew how to grow things, not how to sell them. And the farm was growing. Expenses were rising. There were more people. Money was needed for tools, for seeds, for construction, for food for 30 workers in the winter. Meredith helped, but Meredith was drowning herself. Her household was growing weaker with each passing month. Her money wouldn't last long. He said okay. Avery nodded. Businesslike. Without thanks, as if she'd signed a contract. A week later, Dan realized he'd made the best decision in 6 months. Avery was like a machine. She had calculated the entire farm's finances in 3 days. She drew up a list of expenses and income. She drew up a sales plan. She proposed a strategy. Not to sell the harvest wholesale to merchants on the highway, to sell directly to the cities, bypassing the middlemen. Tomatoes with resonance in Braunwick cost 3 times as much as they did at the village fence. Wheat with resonance was bought by bakeries in the capital for a fortune. And if you could deliver the fruit fresh during the winter months when nothing else grows, the price would increase tenfold. Dan listened and nodded. Avery drew diagrams in her notebook and explained the logistics. Lena sat nearby and frowned, not out of dislike, out of jealousy at the speed with which Avery had settled into the farm. In 2 days, the new red-haired woman knew all the workers by name and remembered how many bags of compost were left at the station. It took Lena months to get to know people. Eileen treated Avery with cautious curiosity. They were complete opposites. Eileen was quiet, pensive. She spoke in riddles. Avery was loud, direct. She spoke in numbers. But on the third evening, they sat together by the stove and talked until midnight. Eileen talked about the properties of resonant herbs. Avery took notes and immediately calculated the market value of each property. By morning, they had a catalog of 40 items ready. Hawan looked at Avery with narrowed eyes, assessing her. Avery looked at Hawan the same way. Two women who were used to calculating the world and not trusting it. On the fifth day, Avery approached Hawan and said she knew something about Castelli that might be useful for security. Hawan listened. Then she nodded. From that day on, they talked for half an hour every evening. Strategy and tactics, trade and defense. Together, they were more dangerous than apart. Soyeon kept her distance from Avery the first week. Noise, energy, confidence. Everything Soyeon lacked. But one day, Avery found Soyeon working in the greenhouse. She sat down, looked at the notebook, at the list of names, at the neat entries. She asked what it was. Soyeon explained, quietly, briefly. Avery listened. Her face changed. The hardness was gone. What remained was a 25-year-old woman who had also lost her home. Not to the rot, perhaps, to people, but she had lost it. She said she would help find seeds of Eastern varieties, that her father might have samples in the old warehouses, that she knew people who traded rare seeds on the black market. Soyeon looked at her, nodded. It was the beginning of a friendship between two people who had nothing left but what they had decided to build anew. Dan watched as the 6 women around him formed something greater than a household. Lina was the heart. She held the people together. Eileen was the knowledge. She understood the world through resonance. Meredith was the shield. She shielded them from politics. Haewon was the sword. She stood between them and the darkness. Soyeon was the memory. She reminded them why they were doing this. Avery was the bridge. She connected the garden with the world beyond the fence. He needed all 6 of them. All 6 of them knew it, and each of them came to him broken, with pain she had carried for years, which she had hidden, which she considered her sentence. And he didn't heal them, didn't save them, didn't say the right words. He simply gave each of them what she needed, not in general, specifically, for her. Tomatoes for Yoren, a name for Lina, roses for Meredith, silence for Haewon, earth for Soyeon, trust for Avery. And each of them sprouted, like a seed in good soil, slowly but unstoppably. The end of winter. Avery presented Dan with her first financial plan. The farm would break even by summer, provided they managed to sell a shipment of tomatoes and wheat with resonance directly to the capital. This required a trade route, wagons, guards, and a buyer. Avery said she had a buyer, an old acquaintance of her father's, a baker in the capital, the only one who hadn't turned his back on her after the escape. He was ready to buy everything they delivered. Dan asked if it was dangerous. The capital was Castellian territory. Avery said that was exactly why they needed Meredith. The Valmont name on the goods meant protection, even if it was temporary, even if it was fading. But as long as the Valmonts existed, no one would touch their trade caravan on the open road. Dan agreed. The caravan set out in early spring. 3 wagons, 12 sacks of wheat, 6 crates of tomatoes, 2 barrels of pickled apples, a box of Eileen's dried herbs. Every item bore the Valmont house seal. Avery rode with the caravan. Hey, Vaughn too. They returned 10 days later. Avery was beaming. Everything sold. The baker took the wheat and paid double. The court apothecary bought Eileen's herbs for such a sum that Avery had to count it 3 times. The tomatoes sold out in a day. People at the market asked where they came from, who grew them, where to buy more. The name of the Hearst garden was on everyone's lips in the capital. Dan sat on the porch of the greenhouse. He was counting coins. He had never seen so much money, not in this life, nor in the last. Avery stood beside him. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Her face bore the expression of someone who had proven a theorem. Dan looked at her. He said she was a genius. Anne very shrugged. She said she was just good at counting. Then she added quietly that Dan was the first man who appreciated her for what she could do, not for what she was worth. Dan didn't understand. He asked what the difference was. Avery looked at him, for a long time, with an expression he couldn't read. Then she laughed. She said that was exactly why it was so easy to work with him. She turned and walked away to take inventory. Spring of the third year. Hurst's garden stood on the hill like a small fortress. 3 greenhouses. Spring of the third year smelled of apple blossoms and wet earth. Dan stood on the hill and looked at Hurst's garden. In 2.5 years, a real farm had grown out of the old man's abandoned plot with a pitchfork. 3 greenhouses glistened with their mica windows on the southern slope. The nursery stretched out in rows of young saplings. The classroom buzzed with voices. In the fields, second-generation selected wheat was turning green. Compost pits steamed in the morning chill. And 3 silvery aril trees stood in the central greenhouse like little sentinels. Dan should have been happy, but he couldn't, because he knew what the others didn't. There wasn't enough time. Gray rot was accelerating. Meredith had sent a map 2 weeks ago. The black spots had spread twice as far as last year. The Valmonts had lost another 15% of their land. The inoculation was working, but too slowly. They were curing 1 acre a month. The rot was devouring 10. Like a man bailing water from a sinking boat with a teaspoon. Eileen confirmed his fears. She had spent the winter studying the echoes in the gray earth. What she found was worse than they had thought. The creature underground wasn't just dying. It was already nearly dead. Its resonance was still holding the soil structure together in the central provinces, but with each passing month, the signal grew weaker. Eileen said that according to her calculations, in 3 or 4 years, the resonance would disappear completely. The gray rot would cover the entire empire, every field, every garden, every forest. And then, nothing would grow. Nowhere. Dan sat at the table in the workshop. Before him lay a map and 3 twigs of silvery bark. 3 years until Errol's fruits. 4 years until the creature's demise. A difference of 1 year. 1 damned year. He rested his head in his hands. He closed his eyes. He thought. He needed to speed up the tree's growth. But he couldn't speed up time. That was his main limitation, the one rule that couldn't be circumvented. Plants grow at their own pace. An apple tree won't bear fruit any sooner just because you want it to. Or, Dan opened his eyes. He sat up straight. He remembered. Stress. Controlled stress. On Earth, it's called forced fruiting. When a tree senses a threat to its life, it accelerates the transition to reproduction. It tries to produce seeds before it dies. Drought, bark damage, trunk binding, a sharp restriction of nutrients. It's a cruel method. It shortens the tree's life. It wears it down, but it forces it to bear fruit earlier. By a year, sometimes by 2. Dan went out into the greenhouse. He stood before the oldest aerial tree, 6 feet tall, silvery bark, 38 leaves. Healthy, beautiful, full of life. He had to hurt it. Deliberately, calculatedly, so that it would be frightened and start to rush through life. He stood there for a long time. His hand wouldn't move. Eileen walked in. She stood beside him. She looked at the tree, then at Dan. She said she could see from his face that he'd decided on something terrible. Dan explained. Stress. Forcing. Risk. A 1 in 3 chance the tree would survive. But if it did, it would bear fruit 2 years early. Eileen listened. Her face went pale. She said it would kill the tree. Dan said it might kill it, or it might save the whole world. Eileen was silent. Then she said quietly that it was his decision, that she would be there for him no matter what. Dan didn't do it right away. He spent a week preparing. He studied how aril trees reacted to different types of stress. He had 3 trees, the oldest one, and 2 young ones. He wouldn't touch the young ones. They were a backup plan. It was all on the oldest one, the first one. the very graft on which he had burned his hands, saving it from the burning greenhouse. He started gently, cut watering by a third. A week later, by half. The tree reacted. The leaves drooped slightly. The residents, according to Eileen, became anxious. Not sick, restless, like a child who had been woken up in the middle of the night. In the second week, Dan made an incision in the bark, a small one, controlled. The bark parted and silvery sap flowed from it, thick, smelling of honey in a thunderstorm. The tree began to heal the wound. Callus tissue grew quickly, faster than on any tree Dan had ever seen. A good sign. In the third week, he tied a thin rope around the trunk at the base. Not too tight, just enough to slow the sap flow downward, to force the tree to store nutrients in the crown, to prepare for fruiting. The tree fought back. The tips of the leaves turned yellow. The two lowest ones fell off, but the upper ones grew brighter, thicker. The resonance glow intensified twofold. Eileen said the tree was screaming, not from pain, from fear. It sensed something was wrong and was trying to catch up. Lynn came to the greenhouse every evening. She sat down next to the tree. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, as if she were keeping watch. Soyeon recorded every change in a notebook: height, leaf color, number of fallen leaves, condition of the bark. Dan dictated the data to her morning and evening. She turned it into a system: tables, graphs, more precisely, sketches of graphs because there wasn't enough paper. But the point was clear. By the end of the first month, the tree had stabilized. It stopped losing leaves. No new shoots appeared. All its energy went inward. It accumulated. D. Dan removed the rope from the trunk. He resumed watering. The tree drank greedily. 3 days later, buds appeared at the very top. Eileen saw them first. She ran to Dan, out of breath, eyes as big as saucers. She said one word: buds. Dan dropped his shovel and ran. Buds. 4 of them. Right at the very top.